Good afternoon. Welcome, friends, neighbors, and colleagues. I'm Michael Markowitz. I'm director of the Institute for Retired Professionals. This talk is sponsored by the New School Institute for Retired Professionals and the graduate program in transdisciplinary design at the Parsons School of Design. Its director is here today, Jamer Hunt. Thank you for working with us on this idea. And I suspect that that's some reason for there being so many students here. Could you raise your hand if you're a student at Parsons or Lang? Ah. Welcome. Let me tell you a little bit about why we're here. This program is made possible by a gift from the family of Estelle Tolkien, a longtime student at the New School. The IRP is a peer learning group at the New School in which the students themselves develop the curriculum and run the study groups. These Friday sessions are an exception to our rule against having outside speakers because we use them to invite people to come here to engage us and to introduce us to new thoughts, new places, new fields, new ideas. Today's program is the work of one of the members of our speakers committee, Ava Vogel, who herself has a PhD in chemistry and was a longtime researcher at Bell Labs. We invite you to stay for the talk, after the talk, for the Q&A session, and for a reception. Please join us then. And now I'll ask Ava to come to the platform and introduce today's guest. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Eva Vogel, as Michael said. Together with Jane Asmer, we put together this program Friday at 1. This one is the last presentation for this semester, but we are already working for the fall program, and it will be great, and I hope you will continue attend it. I would like to thank everybody who was involved with this Friday at 1. It's not just two of us and Michael. It is, of course, the Tolkien family. Is Pam Tillis, who always help us and guide us from a New School and her whole crew, the gatekeeper who signed everybody, and we thank everybody who contributed. Today we are really in for the treat. Professor Aizenberg will introduce us to amazing structure of nature, especially in, I assume, in deep sea structure, sponges. She began her studies in Russia, continued in Israel, and finished her postdoc in the US. Her degrees are in chemistry, physical chemistry, and her PhD is in structural biology. Joanna is a professor of material science and a professor of chemistry and chemical biology at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. I was introduced to her work while I worked on fiber optics for telecommunication, but as she pointed out, the first practical fiber, man-made fiber, were made in 30s, but sponges knew how to do it 500 million years ago. Again, welcome, and help me welcome Professor Joanna Aizenberg.
Thank you very much, Eva. It's my actual pleasure to give this talk. I really hope that this is what I will be doing when I will have some time. There are so many interesting subjects that I still want to learn, maybe 20 years from now. So I'll try to present to you, and I'll try to excite you about things that really make me feel so great, and that's why I do science. I love the field that is currently called biomimetics, is where we are trying to mimic nature and all the wonderful things that nature can bring. So I'll show you many different things and how they connect together, and how one can take natural lessons and use them in our everyday life to improve living, to improve engineering, to improve chemistry, to improve anything we can imagine. To do that, I would actually, let me give you the outline for my talk today. There would be very strange topics that I will discuss. I will begin with telling you what is biomineralization. I will talk about glass in nature, lessons in fiber optics, lessons in architecture, lessons in monogamy, limestone in nature, and at the end, a little bit of design of sunglasses, hats, and dreadlocks. So biomineralization is something you all know about. Maybe you didn't know what is the definition of biomineralization. Biomineralization is the study of biologically formed inorganic materials. So nature is not only about proteins and cells. Nature makes inorganic materials. And we know that very well because our bones, our teeth, mostly skeletal design, but not only, as I will show you, is made out of inorganic materials. Now, I would claim that biomineralization is, in fact, the most multidisciplinary field that exists. Why? Because traditionally, many hundred years ago, or maybe centuries and thousands of years ago, the part that would teach and look biomineralization was earth sciences. And the reason is that what remains in the earth is the fossil record of biomineralized tissues. And that was a traditional way to look at biomineralization. There was another part, and of course, biology is important. Long time ago, medicine was interested in biomineralization, not only because we want to have healthy bones and healthy teeth, but we also want to suppress mineralization that we don't want to have. For example, kidney stones or calcification in our arteries. It's all biomineralization. It's done by biomineralization scientists in medicine. Surprisingly enough, actually, biomineralization is a big field in social studies, in art and design. And the reason for that is that if we look at you can find gems in nature, they also come from inorganic materials that are made by organisms. What I will try to focus today is more on the right side of this spectrum. I will try to show you that, in fact, not only these traditional fields, but there are so many amazing solutions that nature can give you in chemistry, physics, engineering, anywhere else. In engineering, it's somewhat known. Of course, we're mimicking nature. When we build houses, we make structures that pretty much resemble, exactly look like mollusk shells. What you may not know, that biomineralization, even before people were able to look at these structures, were using, I'll show you some examples of that, what is called diatomite, the material composed of the skeletal elements of diatoms, as a filtering agents to filter water, for example. So biomineralization is everywhere. What I'll try to do is to use it to show you some examples of amazing things, how nature builds its mineral structures. And let's begin with something common examples. I will then focus on something less known. But if we look at the structure of the mollusk shell, there are two layers. Most people would know about nacre's layer. It's shiny, it's beautiful. That is nacre's layer. The nacre is made out of platelets that are placed at a certain distance from each other, perfectly arranged platelets. Size of these platelets give rise to this shiny, beautiful, iridescent color. By the way, it's not functional color. They don't need this color for their life. They didn't create it as optical design to improve their living. It's just the artifact of making a very strong material out of thin plates of calcium carbonate. In this case, material is calcium carbonate. The strongest part of any shell is what is called prismatic layer. It's the outer layer of the shell. And again, if you look at the structure, it's composed of limestone prisms sitting inside the envelopes of organic material. And we know it's very strong. And we know that we build buildings exactly this way. Let's take another material, and the material that I will use now is, I want not only to show you something we all know exists, but I now want to switch and say, nature doesn't use only calcium carbonate, limestone, for skeletal production. It also makes skeletons out of calcium phosphate. So bones, teeth, mammalian tissues are made out of calcium phosphate. This amazing structure that you see here is in fact the structure of enamel of mammalian tooth. The teeth are strong, and the strength of this is just to the reason for the strength is that nature takes calcium phosphate, thin, long needles of calcium phosphate, puts it together into bundles, then takes these bundles, assembles them in this plywood structure, and all together, this is a material of enamel, and the strength of enamel comes from this amazing structure. Now, just to give you the idea of the scale, this scale bar here is 1/100th of a human hair. So each brick, or in this plywood structure over here, is 1/1000th of a human hair. So just to give you a scale of things in our teeth. Let's go to next biomineralized tissue, and probably now getting a little bit more, that's already nice design, but bringing more beauty into systems. Nature also uses glass to make skeletons. And one good example are diatoms, and I showed you before that diatomite. So diatoms are single-celled organisms. They're primitive. They were not even able to make multicellular organisms. So in terms of evolution, they're so low, and still they're capable to support their cells by producing glass. They produce glass at normal temperature, not as we do it, going to 2000 degrees. So nature knows how to make strange material glass, use it for skeletal construction so that to support the cell and make it, I just put here a couple of examples. You can find any design you want. 3-fold symmetries, 5-fold symmetry, 6-fold symmetry, holes on one side with holes of a different size. This is just amazing structure. And depending on the porosity, that's why diatomites were used for filtering water or other liquids. In fact, these days, there is a lot of research in engineering and physics on diatomites, diatoms specifically, and not because of chemistry interests, because what is clear now that diatoms are in fact living silica chips. They're made of silica. Not only that, they're perfectly patterned. And when we make silica chips, we have to make a chip, then etch it, then pattern it. It's a huge process. It's what is called top-down manufacturing. Nature knows how to make a decision. This is the structure I want to make, and it will grow it in its final design. Yet another example of glass, because I will focus a little bit on glass from now on. Another organism, and even more forms, more designs, something that's very difficult to imagine. This is actually an amoeba, and it's protozoa. Again, single-celled organism, not really evolved. Not only that it uses glass to make its skeleton, but as if there is a competition in the most beautiful form one can imagine. So every species would make its own skeleton out of glass, having a completely different design. So just some of them are shown here, just from two groups. And as I said, every species, every group would have its signature glass beauty. That the only function of it is, in fact, to support the cell wall so that it doesn't collapse. It's another one that resembles antenna, and it's a radial area. Another one, and I will talk about these guys now, sponges. So sponges, in fact, have three distinct groups. There is a group of sponges that most of us know about because it used to be used in the bathroom. It's a sponge that actually doesn't make any inorganic material. It only has organic material, and it's soft. Right? You wouldn't like to have a sponge in your bathroom that is actually filled with either limestone, which is calcarea, makes calcium carbonate skeleton, or demospongia and hexactinellida make glass skeleton. And in particular, that sponge is as hard as it can get. There's nothing spongy about it, but due to the reason biologists use for classification, sponges would all have the same design or the way they feed, the way they do things. Any sponge would have, schematically I would say, this kind of body. It's what is called osculum, opening at the tip of the sponge, and then openings on the side. The only reason? To pump water through these parts and collect any organic matter that is there. Now, sponges are also not very advanced, not very evolved organisms. They are multicellular, but they're actually a collection of cells. There is no organs, there is no differentiation in anything, so pretty much sponge would be a collection of individual cells, and I will tell you now, not only we don't know how, but these cells apparently really talk to each other because what they produce really needs enough communication to do what they're able to do. So let me just go to discuss this sponge. And when we do that, again, I will remind you this entire skeleton is made out of glass. Glass, we all know what is glass. I don't need to give you introduction. We use it for thousands of years. It's the longest record of making glass, using it for construction, using glass for fiber optics, using glass for lamps, using glass everywhere we can imagine to use it. And architectural glass is a common material. We see more and more glass. Although we really want to use it beyond windows, as transparent glazing, as internal partitions, as architectural feature. But we also want to use them in beams and columns. Unfortunately, the safe load capacity of glass is limited. I mean, it's a fragile material. It's susceptible to brittle failure. So if you think about using it in buildings, you need to use a special type of glass, and there are a couple of things that were developed these days by Ingenious to reinforce glass. There is laminated glass, there is glass fiber reinforced concrete, and I give you these definitions. You'll see later on why. So let's get from this immediately to lessons in fiber optics. And Eva mentioned that. So, commercial optical fibers. The first practical, actually, all-glass fiber was, the idea was in the 30s, but used in the 50s. And it's not an easy thing to make. The early ones especially experienced excessive optical loss. They were not as effective. To put light into the fiber, you need lasers. You need something to know exactly where this light would go. And I'll show you what it means with some degree of detail. It has to have a very special design, what is called core cladding design. In particular, how do we make optical fibers? You take glass, you go to 2,000 degrees C, you make a suit, and then you stretch it at this high temperature to produce fibers. That wouldn't be enough, because you do need a core of a fiber to have a little bit different properties, to have a higher refractive index so that light can be focused inside the fiber. I wouldn't go beyond that in description of this. Not only that, it's glass. It's fragile, and we don't want our fibers to break easily. So in general, what is done with optical fibers, they're then put in polymer coating to provide them with some protection from cracking. Okay, what I will do now, I will show you a sponge again. And the name of this sponge, non-biological name of this sponge, is Venus's flower basket. And the reason for that name is twofold. The original reason for that is, in fact, that many of these structures resemble one of the paintings where Venus holds a vase with a cornucopia of flowers, and the vase looks pretty much like that. I don't think it's actually that close to that. But I'll show you there's another reason why that glass sponge can have a nice name of Venus. So this is all glass. If you look over here, there is a crown of fibers. And if you look at these fibers more closely, these are nice glass fibers. On the bottom part, they have the spikes, but on the longer part, they are like that. We can characterize them. In cross-section, nothing interesting, just a fiber. But if you look at them carefully and either etch it or use other techniques to see what is going on there, there is a fiber inside and then multiple layers surrounding it. You can actually see these layers even better if you etch it a little bit. And I don't want to go through details of that, but if I use all the serious equipment that is used to characterize fiber optical properties of fibers that we make, and I will do that with these fibers, they have the same characteristics as what we use in engineering. They have a high index core and low index cladding. They actually exactly like our fiber. If we were to use that 100 years ago, we would come up with an idea of optical fiber much earlier. And indeed, they're capable of conducting light through these fibers. So in these sponges made optical fibers. Fiber optics was developed by them, indeed, half a billion years ago. So what are the advantages of these fiber optics? And then I will show you that it's very strange that they developed that. I showed you that it's coated on the outer side with multiple layers of glass. What it means is that it doesn't need a protective coating anymore because it's extremely strong glass. If now you try to apply stress and crack this fiber, the crack will begin to propagate, but then between these layers, just like in brick buildings or like in shells of mollusks, this energy of this crack would be distributed between the layers, and it would lose its energy, and the crack would not propagate far. And this is just an example of that. I really tried hard to break it. I don't know whether you will see that. There's a little bit dark lines over here. These lines are, each one is a layer of glass, and crack propagates from layer to layer and stops. On the normal glass, it will go through and break it. So it's strong. It has between these glass layers a little bit of glue, protein, that not only glues it together, but in fact acts as a way to remove some energy from advancing cracks. So the material is amazingly strong. Now, the other advantage, and again, I'm not going to talk about it too much, but the fact that we draw our optical fibers in one direction makes optical properties along this direction and perpendicular to this direction different. And it's a problem. It's called birefringence. We don't want birefringence. These guys make their optical fibers at normal temperatures. They don't stretch them, so they have exactly the same optical properties in any direction. Not only that, they actually have refractive index higher than glass. So they make it out of glass, and somehow they make it better than glass. How do they do it? Well, we do it by using certain ions to dope glass. The ions that we use, nature doesn't have available, so it uses what is available. So it takes sodium, puts it inside the fiber, and as a result, it's capable of conducting light. No, it uses something else that we don't do, but maybe we should. So in a normal optical fiber, light comes from one side and completely goes out on the other side. In this case, it has these spikes that I showed you before. So now when light is coming in, each of these spikes acts as a secondary illumination point. And if I now put light into this fiber, each of these spikes would actually be bright, and entire fiber looks like a Christmas tree. So not only the tip that would be lit up, but also along the fiber there would be a lot of light. And to make it even worse, I mean worse in a sense that how could it be that nature does that? We use lasers to put it exactly in a certain direction. Nature doesn't have lasers. Maybe they do. We'll take some research and we'll find that nature actually has lasers. But they need to effectively couple light into the fiber. So what they do, at the end of each fiber, there is a lens. And now light coming from different directions is focused inside the fiber so that for better efficiency of light collection. So what one can say, can these fibers guide light? Of course they can. Not only that, they are remarkably similar to optical fibers that we make and think that we're geniuses and there's something absolutely amazing out there. But these fibers are also mechanically stronger. They have no birefringence. They have light concentration by lens extension. The question that should be asked, where do they get their light? Now, let me tell you that these sponges are the deepest sea sponges that exist. Where they live, which is 500 to 1,000 meters deep in the ocean, there is no light. So nature creates such an amazing fiber optical system just for beauty of it? Could be. But there might be some function. And an interesting thing is that these sponges live and they're attached to the ocean floor. There's no light at that depth. But in the ocean floor, usually together with these sponges, there is bioluminescent bacteria that produces light. The light coming from bioluminescent bacteria is effectively coupled into the fibers of the sponge, and the sponge actually uses that to be a beacon of light. It's bright structure now in the middle of dark ocean sitting on the ocean floor. Let's go further with something else. So go back to structural glass, not only fiber optical glass. And let's think about a couple of lessons in architecture. Let's take a look on the design of this sponge altogether. So just to give you the idea, it's about maybe 20 centimeters long. It's a cylindrical structure that is about 1 inch in diameter. And I'll show you features of that design. And this is, by the way, one of the features of their design. So again, this is all glass. So on the macroscopic scale, if you look at this, let's say that would be the sponge. It's a little bit thinner, but more or less the same length. So it's a cylindrical structure. And if you look closer on this structure, it's actually composed of perfect squares where every second square is empty and every first one is crossed, and it's an exact chessboard design in this sponge. By the way, squares are almost never found in nature. Nature likes six-fold symmetry. Well, today was a little bit of snow. You could see it has six-fold symmetry, and almost everything in nature has six-fold symmetry. These are squares. Not only that, every second one is using diagonal elements at 45 degrees. Not only that, I mean, if you design a structure that is skeleton, you want it to be strong, if you use a cylinder, there is what is called ovalization problem, that it's easy to break it because it tends to make an oval if you have a stress coming to the structure. How to avoid ovalization problem? If I now try to squeeze that part, it's not easily squeezable. And it's done by introducing ridges, structures that are perpendicular to the original tube. Look at that. The sponge has these ridges that are perpendicular to the structure that run across spirally on these glass structures. By the way, again, this ridge, each ridge would appear every fourth square. Not randomly, exactly every fourth one would have a ridge attached to it. Let's go further. So now we know it has a square design and made out of glass beams. Not just a beam. Each of beams over here is in fact a bundle of glass beams. So again, it's much stronger than just to use one glass element. If you want to break a bundle, you have to break one by one. If you think that's all that this organism does, let's take a look at each and every fiber within the bundle. Fiber within the bundle is fiber-reinforced cement. So one thing here is, in fact, a structure like that that has fibers coated with layers of glass, glass and glass and glass coated in glass. And if we look at this, and the picture that I showed you before was from one of those structures. If you etch it a little bit, you can reveal many, many layers. So in a way, you can think about it that nature creates a structure, let's say square array like that, but it's not yet strong enough, and then it puts it in a layer, puts it in a glue made of glass, takes it away, it makes one coating, then it puts it again, makes another coating, and makes it many-layered laminate glass to make it as strong as one can possibly imagine. So if you actually look at the cross-section of these sponges, there's many interfaces like that. It's laminar. This is not a schematic, it's an actual design of the sponge. And even that is not all, because every fiber over here is very similar to what I showed you before, is coated with multiple layers, shells of glass, so that each fiber is very strong. And when you go beyond that, there is a protein gluing it together. And what that means, let me now show it schematically, is that you can't imagine what else can be done to make the material stronger than that. This is glass, but now it's glass that is almost impossible to break. So you can step on it and it doesn't break, being made of brittle material. Not only that, this design of open cell, closed cell, one may say, okay, it's clear that if you make a closed cell, it's stronger than open cell, because open cell, if it would be just square design, imagine we're building bookshelves. If it has just a square design, it's easy to shear it and it will collapse. What do? Simplest thing to do, on the back, we provide two diagonal reinforcements. It's exactly what this organism does. But it may provide other reinforcements in these empty squares. Why doesn't it do it? In fact, there is a mathematical formula that would provide you the strength as a function of how many crossing like that would exist in material. And that specific design is a minimum structure that gives you maximum mechanical stress. You can now add more, but it wouldn't make the structure stronger. Not only that, so now we're seeing that there is an organism that makes a skeletal design which is optimized for at least two functions. One is mechanical, very strong. The other one is also optical, but the third function is fluidics function. It actually wants to live, and to live, it has to pump liquid. If I were to add now more glass to the structure, the openings of these windows would be too small for water to go through, or the organism has to apply a lot of energy to pump water through that. So it actually chooses to have empty window and crossed window, and water goes freely through the larger windows to provide the pumping action. So at least three functions are optimized in this case. We don't know how to make materials that are optimized for multiple functions yet. Now, it's amazingly strong, but it makes it even stronger by some interesting idea. And it's a bad time to talk about it now, especially after the earthquake. But it's strong as it is, but the fact that the organism is attached to the ocean floor, the buildings are attached to ground, the highest stress it has is usually at the point of attachment to the ground. So if it's attached, there would be always a certain force that you can apply and break it. It could be a high force, but still you can reinforce this part. But it will break if it's just attached as a solid structure to the base, to the point to which, let's say, the ocean floor in this case. So what does this sponge do? It actually makes the attachment point soft enough so that if there is a current or there is a fish swimming by, touching the sponge, it would swing without mechanical damage. So it can withstand any stress you can imagine and still stay like that. But only, in fact, at least to me, when I looked at the structure and described it, it gave me a lot of questions, and in particular related to the fact it's not evolved organism. It doesn't have organs. It has a collection of cells, how they talk to each other to create such a perfect square design where you have ridge every 4 squares and a cross every 2nd square. And it's amazing. And how even this 4-fold symmetry is established? What defines that? So we decided that, okay, structural ridges, let's look at them more carefully. So they go, as you could see this is empty. Here is no ridge. Here is no ridge. The 4th one has a ridge. And if we define them and make a computer design and of exact structure of the sponge, this is how it looks. So every part of this ridge is nicely connected to the underlying tube of a sponge. So this is a real organism. This is a computer model of this, and now we know how these are constructed. Okay, but let's go further. Everything that I described to you so far about design of this sponge, it's on the outer side. Let's now forget about it, or let's try, which was not easy actually to make, to remove all these layers that I described to you, the beams, the diagonal reinforcement, the ridges. Let's remove them all. Let's see what remains inside the sponge. And what actually remains is that structural element. The name of it, biological name for it, is cruciform spicule, which is in fact a little bit wrong because it's not flat. It has about 20 degrees angle from planar to its one arm of that is off plane. So if I remove everything from the sponge, I will see these guys. If I now look at these things, so let's say this is a computer simulation of this structure, and I put them together, since they are not planar, If I combine them together, they will make a circle. Now, let me tell you something that I didn't yet, is that there are no small sponges. They somehow don't grow. So how do they grow? How they develop that? They always have the same diameter. So how this diameter is established, they always have the same size of the fibers. So it's not that when it's getting older, it's adding material. No, there's something else happening there. So if now I combine these structures together, it forms a circle with exactly the same diameter that the original sponge. So this is what makes the original design. But, as I said, they always have the same features. And in particular, the size of the square window in these sponges is 2.5 millimeters. And if I make a circle like that, the size here is 5 millimeters. So something is wrong, but if we make now two circles like that and superimpose them halfway, you actually make a window that is 2.5 millimeters. And if now I build them further and further and further, you actually have the structure of your sponge. So what organism does is a thing that we don't know how to do yet, is what is called self-assembly of structural elements in a certain way to define a structure, to define a symmetry. It assembles into a tube like that and waits to be satisfied. And what does it mean to be satisfied is I'll show you in a second. Let's take a look from the top. So now you have these non-planar elements. Just to show you that it's indeed what is happening in the sponge, I will show you the actual photograph. And you could see these angular features and actually can follow it for you. This is the structure of this sponge. But now, often at the top, the diameter is larger than at the bottom. So how is it done if it's all composed out of the same element? It's quite easy to consider it now. Now imagine that I'm a sponge. I'm building my skeleton. I don't want it to be affected by local environment, local conditions, and there's no wind in the ocean, but there is currents in the ocean. Currents at the bottom, close to ocean floor, are lower than currents beyond that. So now to let the current go through without breaking my structure, or actually without even making it swing around, you want to make openings smaller in the bottom and make openings larger at the top so that now higher flow can go from through the top without disturbing the sponge. So this is exactly what is done here. And by really easy means, they now can assemble these structures, and depending how much they overlap, it would be either smaller diameter or larger diameter. So before it makes the other structures on top of this to reinforce it, it puts together the self-assembled structure, optimizes to local environment to have minimal effect of the environment, and after that mineralizes it. So this is just to show you this scaffold. It really looks like scaffolding that we use when we construct. It's exactly the same structures, just to have loose structures to determine the overall design that we need, and then we'll add other structural elements. Well, let me show you a little bit more, just to show you more of these wonderful features of multiple fibers running in this direction. Opening with large openings is one of those. And if it's another cross-section, look at this. It's fiber-reinforced material. It really looks like fiber-reinforced materials that we use in construction. And telling that, I'll skip that, but what I want to tell you is that, okay, I'll skip that because this is probably more interesting. I will first show you fast movie to go again through this amazing structure. Ridges for reinforcement of the tube. square lattice design to avoid shear. In this square lattice, there's diagonal element in every second square. To make these stronger, each beam is actually multi-beam structure. Each of these multi-beams is, in fact, fiber-reinforced cement. And now each of these guys has layers of glass, laminated glass, reinforced with protein. And in the center of each fiber, there is a protein filament that actually makes the fiber surrounding it. And look at this beauty. Look at that beauty. Look at this beauty with all these crossings. And let me tell you a little bit more about that part. And this is where I would go from fiber optics and architecture to monogamy. As surprising as that. This is, in fact, illuminated glass house of the deep, and really a glass house, because about 70% of these sponges are houses that are rented, or I don't know, maybe owned, by shrimp. Inside these glass houses, there is always a pair of shrimp, male and female, living inside one house. The shrimp is huge. In fact, it cannot escape. It's so big. Just to show you how big, this is a claw of a shrimp, and just compared to the openings of this house. So this is indeed an illuminated house used by another organism to live in it. It's a glass house where you can throw stones because you can't break it. And the question is, okay, we now see one at least level of symbiotic life where light from bioluminescent bacteria goes into sponge distributes it, but it's more than that. What does this shrimp get? The shrimp cannot swim in looking for its own food, so that's a disadvantage compared to a shrimp that swims. But it's fully protected from enemies. It's impossible to chew on this sponge. So the shrimp living in this house is mechanically protected. Nobody can get in. But it needs food. Now light produced by, or distributed, not produced, but distributed by the sponge house in which it lives, attracts anything to this location. Any living creature is attracted to light, so that there is enough food surrounding the sponge location. So the shrimp has enough food to have. Now, what does sponge need from that? Sponge is really not evolved enough to need a serious food. It just needs products of life cycle of shrimp. Whatever comes off as small organic particles are now consumed by a sponge. Now, why it is a lesson in monogamy is that, in fact, there was almost nothing about these sponges in any literature. So I pretty much began this study myself. But the only thing I could read about it is that it is used in Japan as a present that is given at the wedding present, because they know that inside these sponges there is always a male and female shrimp living together in one house. So that was a gift that was given to a bride and a groom to have a house of this kind. Well, it's also a kind of house marriage you can't escape from. But really, it's a story like that. I mean, it's a real life story, but it's not as nice, of course, as it is, because how is it done? How the shrimp gets inside the house? Well, they have kids, they have babies. The baby's larval shrimp is small enough to be much smaller than the openings of these houses. So shrimp would eat everything possible and impossible. They would eat their own babies. Babies swim away from the house, they find their own house, and often, usually, more than two would get into this space. Suddenly they have feast. The food is coming on its own. They don't want to leave the space where density of food is so high, and they very fast grow beyond the size of the windows, and they cannot escape. Now, at that moment, there are more than 2 shrimp, usually, in one house, but there is always one alpha male, and everybody, except for one female, gets eaten on the way. So, but the outcome is still, there's 2 shrimp left. In fact, I actually found quite a number of those. There was only one, and a clear remains of the second one, and I'm wondering that whether it was an argument and finally something happened there. So let me, I'm not sure I will have enough time to do I'll still show you a couple of other examples. I want to go to another organism. I want to talk about the echinoderms. The echinoderms, we all know them. Sea urchins, starfish, brittle star. Very interesting organism, very evolved, and almost nothing is known about it. I'll try to show you maybe in one slide, not a lot, how beautiful this material their skeleton are. I'll also show you that it can give really interesting lessons in optics, different from fiber optics, and then something else. Okay, what these guys do, they use limestone for their skeleton. And they make, let's say this is a sea urchin. Each spine of a sea urchin with this beautiful design is what is called a single crystal of calcite. It means that it's not, glass is not even crystalline material. So the material from which this is made, calcite, if you will grow it, and it's easy to make this material, but this is the only way it will grow. This is synthetically, this is in geology. So limestone would look like that. I mean, it's a nice crystal, boring though, just squares, that's it. And exactly the same material that would not be recognizable unless I take these pictures. If I take X-ray, if I take any technique to characterize the crystal, this would look exactly the same as this. So nature knows how to take a crystal, drill holes in them, produce these beautifully designed smooth walls, still keeping it as a single crystal. So to me, it was always really similar. I love this painting, and this really resembles calcite structure. And that curvature, a goal on a sphere by Picasso, resembles these curved structures, and still how nature can do that. And how nature can do that, I will tell you that what is done is that nature makes a protein that can only mineralize, make the skeleton in certain location, but not in others. And as a result, these interesting shapes are formed. We take this lesson and we learn from that. Now we can make crystals that have any shape we want, just learning from this organism. So now we can make synthetically a material that would have pores inside, still being a single crystal. So this new approach to nanofabrication was purely inspired by natural system, something that we didn't know how to do before. Before that, to make a crystal like that, we would take calcite and drill holes in it, etch it down. Now we know how to just say, this is I dial in the structure I want to make, and proteins do it for me. You can make opals out of calcium carbonate and make structures of that kind using biological strategy. So it's a nice lesson in crystal engineering. We can go to optics, and let me tell you that this is brittle star, and that specific brittle star has sensitivity to light. Sensitivity to light, and described in the biological literature, that it's mimicking the environment. It's an example of biomimicry because it changes color from black to white. this is such a wrong explanation altogether. Yes, it does change the color, but by the way, this organism is black during the day and white during the night. It's just the opposite of being not detectable in the environment. So it's definitely not biomimicry. It's a different reason why it decides to change the color. And the reason for that is that if you look on their skeleton, on top of the skeleton, there are perfect lenses. And these lenses collect light, and to optimize light to exactly what they want, to run away from predators when the shadow from predator comes in. During the night, what they do, well, let me skip that. Skip that too. I will tell you just the ending of that. So during the night, this organism uses pigment. During the day, it uses pigment that covers the lenses because it's too much light. These guys are swimming in a nice Caribbean, a lot of light here. It's not like a sponge before. So when there's too much light, they protect themselves with the layer of pigment. They become dark during the day, and during the night, when the light is limited, they withdraw this pigment to see more light. And then they have very nice detecting material where the light is collected to decide where to go, where is a better location. And in fact, they do use sunglasses. And not just sunglasses, that transitional sunglasses that change their property depending and exactly responding to intensity of light. And that's why they're actually black during the day and white during the night. Now, we make now lenses based exactly on that design. I mean, I think the only thing I do in science, I'm stealing from nature. I don't even have to invent anything. I just take it. It's a wonderful design already. And I would like to finish with yet another interesting feature of echinoderms that not that many people know. So echinoderms means spiny skin. Yes, they all have spines, that we know. But between these spines, let me show you these structures in a higher magnification, is what is called pedicellaria. On the surface of echinoderm, these guys are in constant motion, opening, closing, opening, closing. Now, it's not yet fully understood what is the function for that, but one function is proven, is that they are used as an extremely effective anti-fouling mechanism, and not the mechanism that we try to use to prevent fouling by using chemicals. By the way, it's already forbidden to use chemicals for anti-fouling in marine environment because we change the environment. Now this is preventing settlement of microorganisms and dust by constant movement. So this movement of pedicellaria produces flow that keeps everything away from the surface. So sea oceans are in fact extremely clean organisms. So I was obsessed with this structure. I really wanted to make it synthetically. And I decided, okay, can I make spines? Oh, okay, anybody in engineering these days can make spines. But anything that we do these days is static. And I want to make structures that moves. Okay, I can make spines. What do I do next? Well, it may have some interesting properties. For example, structure like that would behave, would never wet. So liquids would run away from this surface. It would actually behave the way lotus leaf behaves. But again, it's static. It's something else that I want from that. But we can make materials that respond to environment. In particular, there are gels. You probably all know what gels are. And gels expand and contract depending on the environment. It could be humidity, it could be pH, it could be temperature. So if I now combine my spines with a gel and thinking about it as a simple concept, the spines are skeletal elements and I need a muscle to move them around, then I can produce a muscle that when this muscle contracts, the skeletal element bend. When it expands, they go back up. And indeed, this is what our structures do. So here is synthetic echinoderm skin that moves. So these spines are now put in motion by a muscle of a gel. We call them hairs, but in our case, hairs is hydrogel actuated, isolated, rigid structures. This was the first example of nanometer scale actuators that don't need any energy from moving them with any device. They take signal from environment. In this particular case, you change humidity level, and they change orientation. It could be done also in response to temperature. And what it means that now, potentially, we can make materials that are smart, which means they change. Nature does it all the time, but not our materials, unfortunately. They change depending on the need. So if I now take the structure like that, when it's lying down, which is dry state, when it's dry outside, hot outside, it's hydrophilic, it accepts moisture. But when it's raining and a day like today, it becomes super hydrophobic, and any moisture runs away from the surface, doesn't wet the surface. And it's reversible depending on the change of conditions. You can go further from that, and the winter is almost over, but not completely over. Let me stop this movie for a second and tell you that ice is a big problem. I don't have to tell you that. But the big problem with ice is that it comes not just from wetting properties, but from the fact that there is a frozen rain, sub-freezing temperatures of the substrate. The droplet hits the surface, and upon contact freezes on the surface. And then accumulation of ice occurs. So upon this dynamic contact, things are happening. Nature knows how to deal with that. And there's a couple of examples. This is water strider. What they do, they make these hairy legs. And as they touch water or ice, the hair would deform and nothing gets through these structures. So can we do something like that? With the structure that I just showed you, it would work very interestingly in terms of prevention of ice formation. This movie just showed you what happens if you have a normal surface. The droplet would spread and always stay in contact. And if it's cold, it would freeze. I'll show that in a second. This is hydrophobic coating. The droplet contracts a little bit, but it's, again, always in contact with the substrate, which means if it's cold, it will freeze. So any existing coatings now, even though hydrophobic, they hate water, it will stay in contact. And it's a little bit smaller contact, but it will freeze. Our surfaces, oops, let's go again through that. Our surfaces act as if there is no friction on them. Water spreads, leaves the surface before anything can happen. And let's look at this in sequence. Again, this is hydrophobic. And next is our surface. Nothing remains on the surface. Now I go to minus 20 degrees C, very freezing conditions. So on the surface that is normal surface, it touches the surface, freezes. On the hydrophobic surfaces that I use these days, it contracts a little bit. The movie is slowed down significantly, but of course it will freeze. This is our surface. It leaves the surface before crystallization can occur. So these surfaces would have no ice on them at all. And what one can do is already thinking how to use it for aircrafts, for shingles, for anywhere where ice can create a problem. But we can go further. We can create structures that move in a predictable way. So if we think about hairs, and I said we call our structures hairs, what if I want to move it that way, but not the other way? What can we do here? I can give them a pattern, which means I will have more muscle here than here. Where you have more muscle, you have more contraction. And here is an example of that, where the system responds to temperature now and changes color as it comes into nice pattern, comes back to perpendicular orientation, again making a structure. And in this case, it makes this beautiful design in response to temperature. This, by the way, I don't know why it's not playing. Let's try. This one, again, slowed down, but it acts exactly like this pedicellarium. These claws are coming together and open. Close, open. So we can have structures of that kind. We can now have dynamic material that change color depending on temperature. So let's say the color of the walls in your room would change, whether it's cold or it's not, but it's not only color. Its reflection of light would change. So if these are not hairs but plates, when they stand up, light comes through. When they lie down, they become reflective, and that can be now controlled by the outside temperature. So we can make dreadlocks from this hair and make it not just make a certain pattern, but make it assemble in a nice chiral twist and really look like a dreadlock. And talking about chiral twists and structures that we make, they have a direction, the handedness to these structures, and, you know, it's an important property. We know that chirality is important in molecular level. Our bodies are chiral, proteins are chiral, and everybody's talking about molecular chirality. Everybody is also talking about galaxies, that chirality is important at this scale, but not only. The level of chirality that is not yet explored is at what is called mesoscale, and let me show you an example that it's actually important at the scale of microns, at the scale of hair size. This is, coming back to biomimineralization, by the way, this is two species that are extremely close. There's the only difference between them is direction, handedness of their shell. They're very close, they want to have sex. But unless they have the same handedness, they cannot align their reproductive organs. They try, they cannot leave each other, but there's nothing can happen in this system. And this is a function or dependent on the chirality at that specific scale. There's certainly not galactic scale and certainly not molecular scale. So we can make now braiding out of our spines. We can make them into braids. We can make them in beads, in the hairstyles with beads. And not just the beauty of it, but honestly, to tell you scientific side of things, you can now have these beads loaded with drugs, and you introduce it in the body, different environment, these drugs are now released. So for local specialized environments where you want your drug to be released exactly where it should be done. So now you hold them together with these fingers, and you release them the moment temperature changes or something changes, and it's no longer attached to your fingers. And the last one, I promised hats, and I'll show you another organism, but only 2 slides. This is another organism called coccoliths, another example of single cellular organism that is considered so primitive that it's difficult to imagine it. To a person interested in design and biomineralization, there is no way to call it primitive. Every cell, every species would make a skeleton, in this case it's calcium carbonate, in a head design, but a very different head, different style of a head. Look at these heads. Another species, hats of that kind. There's another species, it even has, I don't know how it's called, but on a hat. There's another one. Let me show you more hats. These are skeletons of coccoliths. And I could go on and on to show these structures. And with that, what I wanted to do is to say that biomineralization, that I love, really provides amazing concepts in anywhere, in material chemistry, nanotechnology, engineering, and art. And you don't have to do it only with biomineralization. It's really, take any organisms out there, they can teach you lessons as long as you understand what is going on there, that you cannot believe where it can bring you in terms of our current lifestyle, our current materials, and energy-saving strategies. So with that, I would like to show that slide that I quite like. It won actually competition for best scientific photography last year, and it's really like fingers holding together. The Earth, at least, and the colored version, we call it Earth, and we have color there. But with that, I want to thank you for your attention.
Hello. Do you think that there is anything extraordinary about humans in terms of what you've been talking about with these smaller organisms?
This is such a nice question, as if you want me to say we're really primitive compared to them. But
No, I'm asking what you discovered about humans that is also extraordinary.
okay. Probably the most extraordinary thing, of course, that we have a brain that now can control a whole range of processes. In a way, almost everything that I described, it could be not as developed, exists in the human body, and it's developed only to the extent it's needed to our the way we live. So our bodies have calcite crystals in an inner ear. They're used to define where are we in the space. So for those of you who have vertigo, it would be related to the disorientation of these crystals in our ear. So our bodies have lenses, of course. So pretty much everything there exists in our body. I actually don't know much about fiber optics, although there are some discussions that in principle a hair on our body can act as a fiber optical structure. But I would say in terms of skeletal design, and I began with that, I think there are much more interesting examples in nature than the skeletal design that we have. It's very focused on what we want to do and on the providing strengths to our bones in different directions with different loads, and it focused on structures that, at least aesthetically, not as interesting as others.
There is all these wonderful structures you have showed and all these different fields. There is one field that you have omitted, and I'm sure on purpose because it's a big field. I presume you would want to recreate these structures. And I guess they are controlled genetically. Right. So the genes, at least in sea urchins and maybe on the sponges, how complex is the genetics? Is there any in vitro work that you actually can make any of these materials in vitro? And I guess that would be probably the long-term goal, is to have the bioengineering creating them. So how far is that gone?
So I do a little bit of this work, but I certainly collaborate with people who are trying to do that. And the biologists always trying to find a system, a model system, that is at least simpler to understand at this moment. Majority of things that I showed to you now are so complex that we're not yet close to their genome or understanding how it affects the building of these materials. But diatoms, the ones that I showed you that forms living silica chips, is a model system now for genetic engineering, and looking at that to understand how genes, whether genes or anything at that level, or maybe epigenetics, is responsible for differences in morphologies, in the shapes of the skeletons that they produce. So what is done there, 2 or 3 diatom species were sequenced. So we now know everything about their genes, and now they go through what is normal in this field, through changing a part of a gene, knocking out some part, and seeing whether the outcome would be losing a pattern or creating a new pattern, and how one can then correlate the emergence of symmetry or emergence of structure with the genes. So it's being done in diatoms. It's nowhere near for the system as complex as these deep-sea sponges, and one reason for that, they're deep-sea sponges. They're very far. They don't want to live in an aquarium. So biologists often choose species that are willing to live with us, they lend themselves for our studies. These don't want to do that. And unfortunately, most interesting creatures that I at least seen are not interested in living in the aquarium. So there are studies, but at very primitive stage at this moment.
Can you explain a little bit more about what you said about the 6 symmetries, that most natural structures are found in 6 symmetries as opposed to squares?
So let me just show one slide for that. I know that I have it in a different context, but it would be good here. So if you take circular or spherical objects, and almost everything in nature is spherical. Sphere is a normal shape of a liquid. If you drop anything, it would always have a spherical shape unless there is a certain field that may elongate it. So sphere is a very common thing. If now you take apples or you take oranges and put many of them together and let them assemble in a structure that is very good for them, without building anything that you want, let them do it, which would be called self-assembly. Nature does everything by self-assembly. It has small particles dropped in the environment where these particles assemble, and these would grow. I'm almost there. I know I had it. Okay, here it is. So if you would take spheres, they would always pack what is called close-packed structure, where close-packed means you can't squeeze anything anymore there. And for that, it's the structure where you have central circular piece. Where's my? Okay. You would have central and 6 of them surrounding them. So just like snowflakes, it would have the best way to fill the space would be to have 6-fold symmetry. And again, you can try to take oranges on the table, compress them together, and you will see that they will pack in such a way that there would be a central orange and then 6 of them surrounding them. If I will do it in squares, I can do it in squares, but nature wouldn't, because if I do it in squares, there's more space that is unfilled, and it's not energy, it's not the best configuration for the system. So anything that self-assembles on its own tries to minimize the energy, and it leads naturally to hexagonal symmetry, to snowflakes. It pretty much leads to snowflakes or closely packed spheres. So this thing, you would have a circular structure in the center and then 6 of them surrounding. So 6-fold symmetry means that if now I rotate the structure 6 times, every time, it would exactly look like before.
Along with that, are you doing anything with graphene? Making graphene.
Popular subject, isn't it? So the question was whether I'm working with graphene, and let me explain what graphene is. I'm sure it came from 6-fold symmetry and also from mechanics, but graphene is a form of carbon that is very similar to what we have in a pencil, the black pencil. It's a very popular material today. This year, Nobel Prize in Physics was given for discovery of graphene. But when we write with a pencil, it would leave behind these black layers, which are actually multiple layers of graphene. But if you isolate just one single layer, it would be exactly this structure where each, if you imagine that each black thing is a carbon atom, it would form sheets like that. And they're extremely strong. And there's a lot of studies, not only strong, they're conductive. And there's a lot of work trying to use graphene everywhere, anywhere and everywhere. So there was a big spike of activities when the Nobel Prize went to nanotubes, saying that if I add nanotubes, and these days, if I add graphene to any material, it becomes much stronger because of these sheets of graphene. So I can tell you that we make these structures over here. This is a synthetic structure that we make in the presence of graphene that adds, in addition to its own mechanical properties, graphene adds, as a secondary material, adds additional level of strength. And also electrically conductive material.
Does any of the work you are doing have application for the curing of illness?
Let me... I can try to find this slide, but it would probably be easier to explain that. So I have a lot of research, big part, not very big, I have very eclectic group from probably what you've seen, you can imagine. So the biological side of my group is working, one of the subjects that really bothers is biofilms, E. coli, and how microorganisms occupy everything, and catheters and implants that immediately get contaminated with bacteria that likes and any environment, and it's very difficult to protect surfaces from colonization by bacterial films. So one of the things that we are trying to do is to, in addition to existing knowledge, chemical knowledge, it's not very, unfortunately, very productive, to fight biofilms, to use this technology that echinoderms use. Instead of just having certain chemical that is leaching out of implant surface, which is pretty much what is used now, and which means that when this chemical is gone, bacteria will settle on this surface. Not only that, bacteria is smart enough is that why they form on every surface? They are capable of putting a first layer of their own material. Now, whatever the chemistry underneath, they don't care anymore. So they attach to themselves. And that's why chemistry is not as strong a means to fight biofilms. What we want to add is this ability to fight biofilms by movement. So if the surfaces have slight movements in them, let's say hairy surfaces that are exposed to bloodstream, and within this flow of blood is actually moving, bacteria hates these surfaces. They really don't like to colonize. Well, we also don't like when the thing is shaking underneath us. So they avoid surfaces that don't have a steady state structure. So that's one part that is medical related.
Let's thank Joanna